My name is Piper, and I was 24 when everything in my life turned upside down. I had what most people would call a pretty good environment, a stable job as a manager in a decent company, a small but cozy rented apartment in the city center, and a guy I felt really happy with. I was head over heels in love with Jake, and even though we'd only been dating for 6 months, it felt like we'd known each other forever. He was charming, successful, self-confident, with that special combination of charm and intelligence that makes the heart stop and the head turn off. We could talk for hours about everything and nothing, discuss plans for the future, laugh at ridiculous stories from childhood, and share intimate thoughts that we didn't tell anyone else. Everything was getting serious, and I felt like my life was finally taking the shape I'd dreamed of. "I think it's time for you to meet my family," I told him one evening as we curled up on my couch, lazily watching some forgotten Netflix series. His hand rested gently on my shoulder, his fingers lazily stroked the strands of my hair, and I felt warm and calm from his proximity. Jake smiled, raising an eyebrow slightly, and nodded. "They'll love you," I continued, squeezing his hand with conviction. "Even my sister will have to admit that you're perfect." My younger sister, Emma, was 22 and had just graduated from college. She was still living with our parents, trying to figure out what she wanted out of life and find her place in this world. We've always been close, despite the slight age difference, but lately I've noticed that there's been a strange tension between us. She began to distance herself, rarely called first, and when we saw each other, she was absent-minded and not as chatty as before. I decided that this was due to the stress after graduation, the failures in finding a job, and the general sense of uncertainty that many graduates face. Dinner with my family was scheduled for the following weekend, and I spent hours preparing, wishing everything would go perfectly. I chose an elegant but unobtrusive dress for the evening that I knew Mom would like, made Dad's favorite dessert, and warned Emma that I wanted her to be friendly. Jake, like a real gentleman, brought wine and a bouquet of delicate cream roses, which instantly made Mom glow with approval. From the moment he entered our house, I realized that he had made the right impression. "Oh, Piper," my mom whispered enthusiastically to me, taking me aside in the kitchen while Dad and Jake were animatedly talking about something in the living room. "He's absolutely wonderful. Such good manners, such posture, so handsome." I smiled proudly, but noticed Emma rolling her eyes, defiantly snorting from her place at the bar. I ignored her reaction, deciding that she was just jealous that I had a stable relationship while she was still searching for herself. The evening went better than I could have hoped. Dad and Jake found a common language thanks to their love of golf. Mom never stopped admiring his career achievements, and even Emma seemed to thaw a little, although her smile still looked strained. As we were leaving, Mom hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "Don't miss him, honey." A few weeks later, Jake and I started talking about marriage. It was an unconventional proposal, without a ring, without theatrical gestures and pretentious words, just a conversation over dinner, when between spoonfuls of dessert he reached across the table, took my hand and asked, "We could get married in 6 months. Just a modest wedding, just family and close friends." I didn't think about it. It seemed to me that this was how it should be. My parents were thrilled when we told them. They immediately insisted on paying half of the wedding expenses, and Jake's parents agreed to cover the other half. The whole family was happy, except for Emma, who sat silently during the discussion, picking at her plate with a fork and occasionally making irritated puffing sounds that everyone preferred not to notice. The next 5 months were a whirlwind of wedding preparations for me. Every free minute was filled with solving many issues: color palette, dress selection, cake tastings, menu approval, site visits, meetings with organizers and suppliers. I tried to keep up with everything, balancing work and planning a celebration, often staying late at the office to squeeze another call or meeting into the schedule. I felt exhausted, but happy, because I had a new, better chapter of my life ahead of me. This Tuesday started the same way as any other, without any premonitions or warning signs that could prepare me for what would happen later. I had a morning meeting with a florist, during which we finalized the color scheme of the wedding arrangements, after which I went to the office, where I had to work out the reception schedule with our coordinator. It was going to be a busy day, as it has been for the past few months, but at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I felt a throbbing pain in my head, and before I could find a migraine pill in my bag, my boss gave me a quick, appraising look and, without giving me a chance to object, told me to go home, saying that I look like I'm about to pass out right at the workplace. At first, I thought it was annoying. I still had so many things that needed attention, but then it occurred to me that this might be a great opportunity to spend time with Jake. He worked from home on Tuesdays, and I imagined how I would enter the apartment, order us something delicious, we would settle on the couch, talk about the upcoming wedding, maybe he would even help me with some remaining organizational issues. This thought seemed so cozy and right to me that I hurried home, looking forward to an evening spent in peace and quiet, away from all the worries. When I opened the door, the apartment greeted me with an unusual silence, but muffled sounds came from the depths, as if someone was talking softly or perhaps watching a video. I immediately decided that Jake was on a work call. He often retreated to the bedroom during such conversations in order to achieve a better quality of communication, and I even smiled when I imagined him frowning, intently listening to colleagues or clients. I wanted to slip quietly into the kitchen, but something in the tone of the voices made me freeze. I didn't know what exactly alerted me, whether it was some strange, barely perceptible tinge in the sounds, or the very fact that there should have been no one in the apartment at that time except the two of us. Before I even realized what I was doing, my legs were already carrying me forward, and now I was pushing open the bedroom door, as if something inside was telling me that I should see what was hiding behind it. I will never forget what I saw at that moment. Jake and Emma, tangled in the sheets, in an obscene, shocking intimacy that my mind refused to accept as reality. I stood in the doorway, and the whole world shrank to a single point: to this room, to this bed, to these two people whom I loved and trusted more than anything in the world. Everything seemed to slow down, time stood still, and only the booming, measured beating of my heart filled my ears. The first thing that struck me was the look on Emma's face. She didn't look shocked or scared, she didn't even try to jump up and cover herself. Instead, she just looked at me with a slight annoyance, as if I had intruded where I did not belong, as if I had interrupted her for some insignificant, unremarkable activity. Jake's voice was hoarse, confused, and he was already trying to get up, fumbling for clothes, obviously desperate to find words that could fix the situation. "Baby, I can explain." Something inside me snapped. Without saying a word, I turned around, heading straight for the wardrobe. I was seized by a strange, chilling calmness. Emotions seemed to freeze in me, giving way to a cold, measured action. I grabbed the first clothes that belonged to both of them, rolled them into a ball, stepped to the balcony and, without hesitation, threw things over the railing, watching as they scattered across the parking lot below. "Piper, don't." Jake sounded panicked, but it was too late. I turned to them, straightened up, without lowering my eyes, and, surprised at my own calmness, said, "Come out." The voice sounded flat, emotionless, frighteningly quiet, but filled with such steely determination that they had no choice but to obey. Emma pulled on another sheet, as her clothes were already decorating the asphalt 3 floors below. The sight of her slowly shuffling towards the door, trying to keep her dignity intact in just a piece of Egyptian cotton, might have seemed ridiculous if I hadn't felt like everything inside me was falling apart. As soon as the door closed behind them, I turned around, took a couple of steps to the side, and then slowly sank to the floor, leaning back against a tree. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring blankly into space, trying to figure out what had just happened and why it seemed to me that the air around me had become heavier, that every second dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. When the phone rang, the sky outside the window was already beginning to turn into the copper shades of sunset. I shuddered, looked at the screen and saw my mother's name. Relief flared up in me as quickly as the pain. Of course, she called to support me, to tell me that everything would be fine, that I had done the right thing. But I couldn't be more wrong. "How dare you humiliate your sister like that?" she hissed as soon as I answered. I froze in disbelief. Throw her clothes out the window. Make her come out in a sheet. What were you thinking? What was I thinking? No. What was Emma thinking? What was Jake thinking? "You've always been so dramatic, Piper," Mom continued in an irritated, distant tone, and something inside me turned cold. "That's why." I didn't let her finish. "The wedding is off," I said. I expected indignation, a scream, but all I heard was a cold, indifferent, "No, you won't cancel it." I froze. We discussed this with Jake's parents. We talked to him. We talked to Emma. Pause. "The wedding will take place as planned. Emma will take your place." 5 words. 5 simple words that felt like a physical blow. I even ran my fingers over my skin, checking if there was any blood left. Because something so painful couldn't go away without a trace. "You can't be serious," I whispered, feeling my voice tremble with a mixture of horror and rage that washed over me like an uncontrollable wave threatening to overwhelm and engulf. "That's crazy. You can't just." "We paid for half of this wedding," Mom interrupted me, and there was not the slightest hesitation in her voice, not a shadow of sympathy or doubt, just the cold, businesslike confidence of a person accustomed to solving issues without regard for the feelings of others. "Jake's parents paid their share. Everything is already booked, everything is organized, and we won't throw all that money away just because you're having a tantrum." Hysterical? Everything boiled up inside me, and the words came out of my mouth before I could contain them. My fiancé and my sister were in my bed. How can this be hysterical? Mom sighed heavily, as if I was a stubborn child who didn't want to share her toys. "You need to grow up, Piper, and stop being so emotional about everything that's going on." She sounded tired, as if she'd said it 100 times before, as if I was the problem and not the people who betrayed me. And then the line went dead. I don't remember much from that night. All I know is that I cried until there wasn't a drop of moisture left in my body, until the tears stopped flowing, but that didn't make the pain any less. I know I screamed into my pillow until my throat hurt, until every breath was an effort. I threw up twice, as if my body was physically rejecting what had happened, as if it was rejecting betrayal, trying to get rid of the poison that was eating away at me from the inside out. When the morning light filtered through the curtains, I found myself curled up on the bathroom floor, still in the same clothes I'd come home in yesterday. The cold tiles were the only thing I felt at that moment. Everything else seemed numb, distant, as if I were watching myself from the sidelines, this broken, exhausted woman who once believed in love and family. My phone vibrated periodically, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Finally, around 9 in the morning, when the screen lit up again, I saw the name of Sarah, my cousin, the only person in the family with whom I was really close. "Piper," her voice was hesitant, cautious, as if she was afraid that any wrong intonation might break me. "I just finished talking to your mom." I tensed, my heart skipped a beat, waiting for what would happen next. "What did she say?" Sarah hesitated, and I could almost hear her choosing her words. "She called everyone in the family." Everything went cold inside me. "And what did she tell them?" Sarah paused briefly, and then, as if making up her mind, blurted out, "She tells everyone that Jake broke up with you because he fell in love with Emma. She says that everything went very politely and in a grown-up way, but you don't handle it well." My stomach clenched painfully, and I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the nausea. "The wedding is still taking place," Sarah added, almost in a whisper. "Only with Emma instead of you." I felt like something inside of me was completely broken. "What else does she tell everyone?" Sarah sighed, and there was something like shame in her voice. "They tell everyone not to bother you for a while. That you're behaving inappropriately. that you need to come to your senses and think about everything properly. I pressed my forehead against the cold tile, hoping that its coolness would at least cool down the burning rage that consumed me completely at that moment. My whole family. Every person I thought was close. They didn't just betray me, they cut me out of their lives, as if I were an extra, unnecessary piece in their perfect puzzle. They were protecting Emma. They were protecting Jake. They justified the betrayal that destroyed everything I had. But I won't let them destroy me. This morning, when that fire was still burning inside me, I made a decision. I will not give them the satisfaction of seeing me burn in my anger. I won't let them hear my tears. I won't beg. I'll just disappear from their lives as completely as they erased me from theirs. The next morning, I went straight to the office of my boss, Karen, without even waiting for her to take her first sip of coffee. I need more work, I said, straightening my back, despite the fatigue that gripped me from all sides like a steel vice. The most difficult projects you have. I want them all. Karen slowly took off her glasses, studying me closely. Piper, you're already working your ass off. And with the wedding. There is no wedding, I interrupted her. And I need to be busy. Much busier. Something in my face must have convinced her, because after a moment she silently opened a desk drawer, took out a thick folder, and handed it to me. Thompson's account, she said. No one was able to crack it. It's yours if you want it. I took the folder and, without hesitation, opened it, plunging into my work. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I would no longer let them decide who I should be and how I should live. I found a new apartment that weekend, a small studio on the other side of the city, without any memories, without traces of the past, without ties to a life that no longer existed. I changed my phone number, blocked all family members on social media, got rid of everything that connected me to them in any way, and threw myself into my work, making her the only life raft in the raging ocean of pain that threatened to engulf me entirely. Thompson's account, which no one could hack, was dismantled by me in 2 weeks. The Impossible Miller project was completed a month ahead of schedule. I accepted any challenges Karen threw at me with icy calm, not allowing myself to slow down or loosen my grip for a second. I worked 14 hours a day, took online courses at night, and studied the competition as if my life depended on it. Work tasks replaced sleep, food, and social life for me. They became the rhythm that did not allow me to stop and think about what had happened, about how Jake and Emma probably lived happily ever after in the house we planned to buy together, about how my parents should maybe they adored their good daughter, telling everyone how sorry it was that their eldest child turned out to be so problematic. A year passed, and I was promoted to senior manager. A year later, I became the director of operations. In my 3rd year, I became the youngest vice president in the company's history. My salary tripled, and I bought the very posh apartment in the city center that Jake and I once passed by, dreaming that maybe one day we could afford something like this. Only now I bought it myself, with my own money, and every time I opened the door and went inside, I was filled with a fierce pride that had nothing to do with him or anyone else. I started traveling. At first, these were short weekend trips, small escapes from the familiar reality, then the routes became bolder and bolder. In spring, I walked through the streets of Paris. In autumn, I enjoyed the fiery leaves in Tokyo. In summer, I drank cold white wine on the Greek islands, feeling the salty breeze on my lips. I posted photos of all this on Instagram not to brag, not to prove anything to anyone, but just to remind myself how far I've come from that broken girl who cried on the cold bathroom floor 3 years ago. 3 years. 3 years without their votes. 3 years without family dinners. For 3 years, during which I didn't know anything about their lives, except for one fact that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hide from. Emma married Jake. I heard this from Sarah, who mentioned it casually during one of our rare texts, perhaps checking how I would react. I didn't react. I was really happy. Not the kind of superficial happiness that I thought I experienced with Jake, not the kind that builds on trying to please other people, meet their expectations, and live up to other people's dreams. It was something else. Deep, warm, unrelated to anyone but myself. It was knowing who I was and what I was capable of, and that was my freedom. Or at least I was happy until the bell rang. On a typical Tuesday, in the middle of the working day, the phone lit up on the table, flashing an unknown number. I stared at the screen, wondering if I should answer, but something inside intuition, a sixth sense, or maybe just morbid curiosity, made me press the button. "Hi, Piper," my mother's voice cut through the space, and it took me a moment to realize that it was really her. I haven't heard her voice in 3 years. "Honey, is that you?" There was a sticky, cloying sweetness in her tone that made my teeth ache. She spoke as if we had just seen each other at a family dinner yesterday, as if nothing had happened, as if I had been on a long business trip all this time and had now returned home. "What do you want?" I kept my voice level, neutral, the way I used to speak at board meetings when I had to negotiate with particularly unpleasant clients. There was a slight, barely noticeable exhalation on the other end of the line, as if her carefully rehearsed fake joy had given the first crack. "Your father and I need to talk to you. Could you come to our house?" "You are welcome." I was silent, feeling like everything inside was twisting into a tight knot. "We had serious conversations about everything," she continued, and there was something in her voice that I didn't like, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I should have hung up. I should have blocked this number, like I did with the others. But before I could realize what I was doing, I heard my own voice. "When?" "On Saturday, around 6. I'll cook your favorite dinner." I hung up the phone without saying another word. The week flew by unnoticed. I threw myself into my work, trying not to think about the upcoming visit, plunging into an endless stream of meetings, letters, strategic plans, and reports that filled my days, leaving minimal space for thoughts about the past. But no matter how hard I tried, my assistant caught me several times just staring at the calendar, not realizing how much time had passed. Saturday's meeting with my parents stared at me from the screen like a living reminder carved in digital stone, reproaching me for agreeing to this in the first place. When the day came, I spent an hour packing, carefully considering every element of my image. My hair was perfectly styled, my makeup was flawless, and my designer outfit was spotless, chosen with such care, as if I were going to the most important business meeting of my life. If I am going to the lion's den, if I have allowed myself to step back into this world from which I was once banished, then at least I will do it so that it is obvious to everyone that they can no longer touch me. I drove slowly through my old neighborhood behind the wheel of a brand new Mercedes, noting how little had changed here over the past 3 years, as if time had frozen, preserving everything in the same shades of childhood and youth. But when I drove up to my parents' house, I was overcome by a strange, unpleasant feeling, because I barely recognized him. The house looked tired, dilapidated, and somehow deserted. The garden that Mom was once so proud of was overgrown with weeds, the paint on the facade was peeling, and the front steps were cracked and clearly in need of repair. I stayed in the car for a moment, watching this ghostly image of the past, and then, without knocking, I pushed open the door, knowing that this visit would be neither warm nor friendly. As soon as I crossed the threshold, a wave of memories washed over me, powerful and painful, covering my head. I wasn't prepared for how much everything here remained the same furniture, the same photographs on the walls, except that in one of them I was no longer there, as if I had never existed. Even the smell was the same, the vanilla candles that my mother always placed in the living room, only now their neat rows reminded me of some carefully planned, verified family portrait, only without me. My parents looked older and haggard than in my memories. My father had more gray hair, and my mother had some new, heavy expression in her eyes. But what caught my attention the most was Emma, standing in the center of the room with 2 small children clinging to her legs, one of whom looked about 2 years old and the other barely a year old. Jake was standing next to her, his hand resting on her shoulder, and although he hadn't changed much, Something about his face seemed alien to me, somehow faded. I was waiting for the pain. I expected to feel rage, resentment, everything that almost destroyed me 3 years ago. But there was nothing. There were strangers in front of me. They were as insignificant to me as the peeling wallpaper behind them. I noticed how Emma's gaze slid over, in my opinion, the outfit, the expensive bag, the perfectly matched accessories, and my carefully constructed appearance, which screamed that I was no longer the kind of girl who could be trampled on. "You look good," she said, and envy dripped from her words like thick, sticky honey. I smiled with all my teeth. It's amazing what you can achieve if you don't waste time plotting to steal other people's suitors. Piper, my mother's voice sounded harsh, with the same note of disapproval that I remembered so well from childhood. "Please, everyone, let's just sit down and have dinner." I allowed myself to be seated at the table, even though everything inside protested against this absurd farce. In front of me was an overcooked chicken that looked like it had been left in the oven for a good half-hour longer than it should have been. I wasn't hungry, but I needed to look at something to avoid making eye contact with those I hadn't seen in so long. The only people who broke the awkward silence were my children, my supposed nephew and niece. The younger one was loudly banging his high chair with a spoon, and the older one was whining because he didn't like peas. Mom cleared her throat, drawing attention to herself. "We've been following your progress, Piper," she began, and I immediately tensed up, preparing for some kind of manipulative move. "Those photos that you post, your apartment, it looks just fine. Right in the middle of the city, isn't it?" I took a sip of water without deigning to reply. "And your job?" Mom persisted. "Vice president." I looked up and met her gaze, studying me intently. "What do you mean?" I asked in a flat voice, knowing that there was more to this conversation than just asking about my life. She hesitated, but then said, "We would like to discuss one thing." I slowly put my fork down on my plate and leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "I'm listening." Dad sighed loudly, and I noticed how he exchanged glances with Mom before she finally exhaled. "We need your help, Piper. We're all so impressed with how well you're doing." Her mother's voice sounded strained. Her gaze darted towards Emma, who was intently examining the contents of her plate, as if the answer to all the questions of life was hidden there. "Why am I here?" I put down my fork, folded my hands in front of me, and allowed myself to look directly at my parents, because I knew they hadn't called me just to discuss my successes and post on social media. Mom's smile faded slightly, her fingers froze on the edge of the plate. She moved the food with her fork several times, as if trying to collect her thoughts, and then took a deep breath. "Well, you see, things have been a little difficult lately." Her voice trailed off, and she cast a pleading glance in her father's direction. "Darling, can you tell me?" Dad looked older than his years, the wrinkles on his face deepened, and his shoulders seemed a little more stooped than I remembered. "I lost my job 3 months ago," he said heavily, as if confessing something shameful. "Budget cuts. After 30 years in the company, I was just cut out." Mom immediately jumped up, as if these words meant that she urgently needed to do something. "I had to take extra shifts at the hospital just to pay the bills." Her voice trembled, but I felt no pity or sympathy for her. "Mortgages, utilities, everything is so expensive these days." I kept a neutral expression on my face, waiting for them to finally get down to business. "And, of course," Mom waved her hand in the direction of Emma, who at that moment was desperately trying to wipe something sticky off the younger child's face, since Emma stays at home with the children. "They live only on Jake's salary," the father added, and I already began to understand where everything was going. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, even though my guess was already beginning to form a clear picture. My mother's face cleared, and her voice gained confidence, as if she knew in advance that I would certainly agree. "Well, we thought," she shot a quick glance at her father and then at Emma, as if hoping someone would pick up on her thought. Emma really needs to find a job, but childcare is so expensive right now. I crossed my arms over my chest, looking at her expectantly. And since you have such a flexible job. I stared at her, waiting for her to continue, waiting for a joke, but it didn't come. I started, but then I couldn't stand it and laughed. The laughter burst out by itself, sharp, biting, filled with pure disbelief. Are you seriously suggesting that I keep an eye on them? Mom immediately perked up when she heard at least some kind of response. You have such a big apartment, she continued enthusiastically. I'm sure you could work from home some days, and the kids are really very well behaved. Right at that moment, a 2-year-old child screamed and launched his non-spilling mug across the room, after which he burst into hysterics, which only intensified my sarcasm. It's a joke, right? I looked around the table at everyone. You're not really asking me to look after my sisters and my ex-fiancé's children? There was a pause filled with tension, until finally his father cleared his throat. If that doesn't suit you, he looked like he was about to get to the point, and I already knew what was going to happen next. You could help pay for a proper babysitter. Considering your salary. I slowly leaned back in my chair, genuinely amazed at their audacity. They lured me here, lured me with this whole family care game, fed me my mom's mediocre cooking, only to end up asking me to either become a free babysitter for my sister's children, or just open a wallet for them. No, I said, standing up. Absolutely not. I felt their eyes boring into me, but I didn't let myself hesitate. I'm not going to be your babysitter, I said firmly. And I won't be your ATM. Her mother's worried mask cracked, giving way to anger. How dare you be so selfish? Her voice trembled, this time not from excitement, but from rage. After all we've done for you. The father slammed his palm on the table so that the plates rattled. You ungrateful, greedy girl. Stop it, he growled. You're sitting here in your designer clothes, living in your luxury apartment, while your sister can barely afford diapers. I looked at Emma, but she still didn't look up, intently picking at the leftovers on her plate with a fork. I took a deep breath, feeling a cold, clear realization creep into my mind. My sister's financial situation is not my problem, I said calmly, in a voice in which there was not a drop of doubt. You have all made your choice. 3 years ago you chose her. You have chosen him. You have made it very clear to whom you are devoted. My words came out calmly, clearly, without a single tremor. Now you live with this choice. I turned and headed for the exit, leaving them sitting at this ridiculous dinner that was never meant to be a reconciliation, walking out to the sound of their screams that chased me down the driveway. How can you be so heartless? Her mother's voice rang with rage. We are your family. My father raged. These children are your nephews. Emma tried to sound plaintive, but even through her voice, I could hear the barely concealed annoyance. Jake, at least, had the good sense to keep quiet. I didn't stop. She didn't look back. I got in the car and drove away, feeling both empty and liberated, but naively believing that this would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, my phone was literally bursting with notifications. It turned out that the mother posted on Facebook a long cry of the soul about her heartless daughter, who forgot her roots and abandoned her family in a difficult moment, turned away from her sister and 2 innocent children who need support. The post was written with such pathos, with such skillful choice of words, that even without knowing the whole story, one could feel the deepest sympathy for a poor mother suffering from the betrayal of her own child. The comments started pouring in instantly. How could she be so cruel to her own sister? These poor kids need their aunt. Money changes people. What really shocked me was that these words came not only from random people, but also from relatives who knew what had happened 3 years ago, from people who had seen the whole drama, but now for some reason decided that I owed it to everyone to forgive and rush to help. Private messages were even worse. They came from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had never been particularly interested in my life, but now found it necessary to tell me that I needed to grow up, that family was more important than resentment, that I had to overcome this. I've blocked them all. One by one. I didn't bother explaining or trying to defend myself. They chose their side a long time ago, and I had no reason to try to prove anything to them. But my family is not finished yet. I was in the midst of an important meeting with our largest client when my assistant burst into the meeting room, looking pale and scared. "Miss Parker," she gasped. "I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but your family is in the lobby. Your sister and the kids, and your parents. They want to talk to Mr. Davidson." I felt an icy, merciless irritation rising in me. Apologizing to the client, I went out into the lobby, knowing in advance what I would see. And, of course, they were there. Mom and Dad were making a scene at the front desk, their voices echoing throughout the room, while Emma was standing a little further away with both children, who were screaming at the top of their voices. People were staring, and some were filming on their phones. "We demand to talk to anyone." My father raged. "She can't treat her family like that." His mother echoed him. "Let's see what her boss has to say about this." I approached the head of security, Marcus, who was already moving towards the angry relatives, ready to restore order. "These people are not allowed in this building," I said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Please take them away." I watched as Marcus motioned for security and they, professionally and coolly, escorted my family out of the lobby, their screams echoing off the marble floor. After that, Marcus came back to me, looking worried. "Do you want us to call the police, Miss Parker?" I straightened my jacket and shook my head. "No. Just make sure they are blacklisted. They should not be allowed into the building under any circumstances." But they didn't stop. Somehow they found out my new address. One evening, returning home after a long day, I found them right in front of the entrance to my house. Emma was there with the children again, desperately using them as an emotional blackmail tool, while Mom and Dad tried to break through behind the other residents, their faces flushed with righteous anger, their voices ringing with reproach and accusations. "We're not leaving until you help your sister." Mom screamed, grabbing the sleeves of passers-by, trying to draw attention to her tragedy. I didn't even talk to them. I just took out my phone and called the building's security service. They appeared again and again. At different times of the day and night, knocking on my door, screaming through it, begging, threatening, demanding that I remember what it means to be part of the family. "You have to help," Mom sobbed. "It's your blood. How can you be so heartless?" My father raged. "You're just a terrible person," Emma hissed, her voice echoing in the darkness outside my door as I stood inside without making a sound. But I've learned a long time ago not to react. I didn't open the door. I haven't replied to any of the messages. I didn't make excuses. They chose their side 3 years ago. Now it's my turn. I started driving home by different routes, changing my schedule, looking over my shoulder wherever I went, because the feeling of their presence, their obsessive pursuit, got into my skin, into my blood, into every minute of my day, turning my life into endless tension. When they started contacting my colleagues, leaving messages in the reception area of my office, and even went so far as to try to reach my business partners through third parties, I realized that this was no longer just annoyance, not the random antics of offended relatives, but targeted harassment, which I could not get rid of by simply ignoring. I tried to deal with it on my own, convincing myself that they would eventually give up, that they would get bored, that they would find a new victim for manipulation, but instead of retreating, they became more insistent, more arrogant, more aggressive. I didn't want to admit that they had won, that they had forced me to take this step, but that day when my assistant told me in horror that Emma had tried to leave the children at the entrance to the office with a note, "Piper, if you don't want to take care of the family, then just take care of them." Just for a day, I realized that this had already crossed all boundaries. I called my cousin Sarah, the only one who remained neutral in all this madness, and finally asked for her advice. "I know a great lawyer," she said without hesitation. "Family matters, restraining orders, and all that." Her name is Michelle Torres. Michelle turned out to be exactly the person I needed. Tough, practical, completely resistant to family dramas, she did not ask unnecessary questions, did not express sympathy or shock, just began to act. "We have collected everything, screenshots of every message, surveillance videos from my building and office, witness statements from my doorman and colleagues, copies of their posts on social media, recordings of all attempts to contact me after they were told to stop. We're requesting a restraining order," Michelle explained calmly as we prepared for the hearing. "They will be prohibited from approaching you at home or at work, no contact, either personally, through third parties, or digitally. And, in addition, we are demanding $115,000 in damages for emotional suffering and damage to reputation." I wasn't ready for what it would be like to see them live in a courtroom again. They looked somehow smaller. Less threatening, less loud, less meaningful under the cold fluorescent lights. Emma, to my surprise, left the children at home, but couldn't resist bursting into tears at one point, trying to portray the suffering of a mother who had been robbed of the opportunity to reunite with her beloved sister. Their defenses were weak. They tried to make themselves look like victims, saying that they just wanted to help their daughter reunite with her family, that they were worried about me, that they wanted me to see my nephews. But the judge was not impressed. "The evidence of the persecution is clear and substantial," he said, flipping through the documents, scanning them with a cold, professional gaze. "The restraining order has been issued in full. The defendants are prohibited from having any contact with the plaintiff, either directly or indirectly. The court awards the requested compensation in the amount of $115,000. This is ridiculous." Mom jumped up, shocked and furious. "We're her parents. We have rights. You ungrateful trash." My father shouted, unable to contain his anger. Emma burst into tears again, wailing plaintively about the children, but the judge did not even look in her direction. The hammer came down with a sharp click, loud as a gunshot. "One more outburst, and I will detain you all for contempt of court," the judge said in an icy voice, and then added, "Moreover, given your behavior in my courtroom, I am imposing an additional fine of $5,000 on each defendant." That was 6 months ago. Since then, the restraining order has been working flawlessly. They can't approach me, they can't contact me, they can't even post about me on social media. The losses and fines hit them hard financially, judging by what Sarah told me, although I try not to think about them at all. I do not know what they are doing now. I do not know if Emma and Jake are together. I do not know if the children grow up happy, if my parents have learned at least some lesson from all this. And the best part is that I don't care. I wake up every morning in my peaceful, spacious apartment, knowing that no one else can break into my life, destroying it, turning everything upside down. I go to my favorite job, discuss new projects, sign contracts, fly on business trips, plan my next trip, think about what to cook for dinner, and for the first time in many years, I live only my life, on my own terms. They say that the best revenge is to live well. But I'm not interested in revenge anymore. I'm just living well. And that's more than enough.